Hattrick Life podcast. Hello, welcome to this fourth episode of the Hattrick Life podcast. In this episode, we go down under and we talk to manager Mambo about the whole concept of the Oceania League nation in Hattrick. Would you imagine having to share your best ever under 21s prospect with your neighboring country? I know for a fact that I wouldn't feel good about sharing my best players with Sweden, Norway, or perhaps even Finland in a Scandinavian country. So we take a look at how you could possibly fix the situation in Oceania, and we talk about how the community down there under feel about this issue. Right, that's all I want to say for now. Let's just jump into the conversation. I hope you enjoy the episode. Mambo, thank you so much for joining all the way from down under. It is a bit of a special situation in down at your place, if I can say it like that. And I've been looking forward to hearing about how you guys feel about your situation. Before we go on to that, I would like to ask you what I usually ask people is, how did you find Hattrick manager game in the first place, starting out as a Hattrick manager?
Well, it is that when I was in the early 2000s, around 2002 to 2004, I was involved in a church group, and there were three young blokes that were a part of that group, and I would hang out with these guys on Sunday afternoons, and that's when Hattrick games get played. So I'd go over to their house and hang out with these guys, and they'd be playing this online computer game, and I'd be thinking to myself, what is this game? And they would talk about it, obsessively talk about this game. And I kind of wanted to bond with these guys, so I thought, well, if they play it, maybe I should play it too. But unfortunately, they had very established teams, so when I went up against them, I got soundly smashed. But this was the old days of Hattrick, where midfield was king, so everybody played 3-5-2, and there wasn't really any other tactical options. But I got very fond memories of the early days of Hattrick. Patriots really improved their tactics. You can now successfully use a whole series of tactics, but back in the old days, I remember there were many times when I would just try to get 5+ stars across my midfield, and that was all that would really matter. Back in the early days, lots of fond memories, and these go back 20+ years. So I went away from Hattrick for a little while. Life happened. I got a job, and I got a family, and things are very busy. But then I returned again in 2021. I had a bit of a short double at returning. It didn't stick the first go because my team wasn't very successful. But then I had another go in 2022 and had a little bit more success, and I rediscovered the love for the game. And then I guess I fell into my early Hattrick habits, because when I went to figure out what I wanted to train, I was immediately thinking, I better train playmaking. And when I returned, I didn't really realize that I had options. I've actually now become a winger trainer, but in the early days of returning, it was all about midfield.
You could certainly say that midfield, if not king, it's still out there. It's still a very important component, and I actually kind of repeated what you said when I returned in late 2022 as well. I started out training playmaking, and then I had a look at the statistics and the market, and I was like, okay, if I want to establish a midfield, surely I should train playmaking, but if I want to establish my club and make some money, I should be doing something completely different. And I ended up training winger as well, and actually made a YouTube video about, hey, if you are returning, playmaking might be the choice if you want to establish your team, but most people cannot just try to establish the club and play competitively from the start, right? So I certainly know where you're coming from. I also have experienced that iterative experience of Hattrick, right? Because this is my fourth time around, and each time I've been playing, I've had a better understanding and perhaps a better patience, I've acknowledged the patience required in order to be successful in the game better each time I've been back with more experience myself and being a little older, obviously. I guess a lot of people feel that way if they are returning managers. I know for a fact that myself, I feel a little envious of the people that sustained their team from back then, simply because it must feel nice. Coming back is also a funny thing to see some of the old names, certainly. The story behind your nickname and your 3 team names, I've spotted something about animals, but I'm sure you'll tell us more about that.
So I'll start with my nickname in the game. I go by manager Mambo, and the story that goes with that is related to this terrible hoodie that I've got here. So you'll see here on the hoodie it says Mambo. I used to wear this hoodie religiously, every day when I was a teenager. So I sort of got the name Mambo because I would wear this hoodie, this orange hoodie, bright orange hoodie all the time. Not a very fashionable choice, but that's what's happened. And so that's a clothing brand down here in Australia. And if you think you're cool, you try to wear that brand, I guess. Things have changed a lot since I got a lot older, but yeah, I was a little bit obsessed, and it was a little bit sad to be honest with you. But anyway, that's the name and how it's stuck. And yeah, there's many stories behind some of my team names. Our main team is primarily Wild Hearts. That came from there's a man who taught me a lot about being a man and a good father. We would talk a lot about what it takes to like raise your sons to become good men. And he would point me towards this podcast, and that podcast was called Wild at Heart. And I would listen to it quite a lot, and I learned a lot from it. So it just seemed natural to take on the name Wild Hearts as a team name. So that's where the Wild Hearts came from. Some of my other team names,
That's pretty cool.
Hills Havoc, FC is a nod to my original Hattrick team. When I started in 2002, I created a team called Hills Havoc because we played for a soccer team called Hills. The region that I live in is in the Hills district in Sydney. And but when I went to recreate it, the game wouldn't let me because my original team was stuck in Division 6 in Oceania, which does not exist anymore. So Division 6 is a locked division, and my team was stuck in it. So I had to add the letters FC on the end of the team name as a nod to my original team. And until Hattrick becomes more popular in Australia and New Zealand, the original Hills Havoc is on permanent hiatus, stuck in Division 6. And then there's two other teams that I run, the Dastardly Penguins and the Spicy Ginger Raccoons. Both of them are nods to ex-girlfriends and wives. So, one of my ex-girlfriends used to, every time she'd look at a penguin, she'd tell me it was dastardly and it was up to no good. So that just stuck as a name, and then even after we broke up, I just kept the name. And then the Spicy Ginger Raccoons was a different ex-girlfriend who put ginger on everything and had an obsession with raccoons. Believe me when I say that she was a very spicy woman. So this sort of became a thing. We ran with it. It was a bit funny at the time. I just think they're really cool names. They're very, very unique names. No one has anything even close to them. I do enjoy those team names.
Did you ever talk to a GM about that team name? Because I'm actually in the same situation. My original club was called Calvehale EF, and I couldn't because my old team is in fact still there as a bot somewhere. I just changed the name to CF because that's a nod to Real Madrid, which I better say I used to support them. Anyway, I changed my name, but I've actually been told you could get a GM to rename your old team to something else, and then you could actually have your desired name. Funny that you went the same direction, referring to your old team, just like I did. I wonder how many people actually do that. I think it's quite nice because I know for a fact that people from my own region has been recognizing me because of my team name. Oh, you must be from there. Should we meet up sometime? Because Denmark is a small country, right? So it certainly adds something to that feel of the IRL community, or taking the whole theme with the ex-girlfriends, and it's a little maybe a little spicy, but certainly unique names.
I just couldn't bring myself to change the names, even though the relationship saying that Hattrick is forever.
Hattrick is forever. Oh, that's another slogan for the game. I think me and Mambo in the last episode talked about Hattrick. That's the only thing that remains constant in my life. I've already said a little about it, like playing in Oceania. How do you feel about this regional community solution? Because you cannot be happy about it. So would you tell us more about this whole thing?
Well, yeah. So Oceania is a constructed nation It doesn't exist. It's a merger between Australia and New Zealand, a whole series of Pacific islands. I think the moderators of Hattrick have openly admitted that the construct of Oceania was a mistake that they made early on in the game, very, very early in the early years. The thing that I find unusual about Oceania is that we play under an Australian flag. We have an Australian mascot. The team name for our national team is based around an Australian drake. When we moved to make Oceania more inclusive of island nations, we moved to include the Aboriginal flag, which is actually something that's related purely to Australia. There's a lot of symbology that's Australian based, but the concept of Oceania was that in the early days of Hattrick, that the Oceania managers, so Australian managers and New Zealand managers, wanted to come together because they didn't feel that Australia as an individual nation could compete, and that New Zealand didn't feel that they could compete. So they said, well, we want to work together and we want to take on all the island nations as well. We now think that it's probably about 90% Australian owned teams in Oceania. There's a strengthening of the Kiwi owners, and it's become a really interesting point of discussion for me because I just wonder whether the reasons why it was made in the first place are still valid. And as I started to do a little bit of research, I researched with a national coach to talk about the issue and a bunch of very experienced Oceanian managers just to find out what their opinions were on whether they still were emotionally connected to the name Oceania, or if they would be open to the idea of trying to find a solution to it. You know, it's a really sensitive issue in the Oceanian community. Some managers are very emotionally connected to the name. They've been playing Hattrick for more than 20 years, and they've always represented Oceania. But for me personally, when I play Hattrick, I want to represent my nation, and I'm Australian. I want to represent Australia. I also want the chance to have Australia compete against New Zealand, because that's a very important rivalry in this part of the world. And if you really want to piss off a Kiwi, try calling them an Australian and see what kind of response you. So I'm sure that in your part of the world, you probably have those same sort of rivalries in Scandinavia, I'd imagine.
I could bring up the same argument if you call a Danish a Swede. Yeah. That's an ongoing joke and an ongoing rivalry, and we wouldn't accept such a solution.
So to take my point a little further, all this symbology is Australian based, and it's kind of accepted by the New Zealand managers that Oceania is just a rebranding of Australia. It's a bit of a shame, and it's really tough because if you talk to the New Zealand managers, they kind of want New Zealand. They want New Zealand in the game. But what they don't want to do is not be competitive. So I think some of the problem is if you split Oceania, New Zealand needs to be able to be competitive, because they're going to lose 90% of the base of what they've worked with for the last 20 plus years. And the other thing that's a very important point is that people that have been in the game from the very start have a very strong emotional connection to the name Oceania. So any solution that you come up with, you cannot dissolve Oceania, because I think there needs to be a nod to Oceania in Hattrick forever. It cannot be buffering off. If you want to respect those managers, all those years that they put in, Oceania needs to remain in some way. In the research that I've done and the conversations that I've had with many managers, some of them would say if Oceania was completely dissolved, they'd leave the game. That's how much it matters to them that day. Oceania has won medals in Hattrick World Cups, and those medals need to be honoured. That history needs to be honoured. So any potential solution has to allow for that. I'm thinking to myself, how can I also allow for a situation where Australian managers can represent Australia, New Zealand managers have the chance to represent New Zealand, and also you keep Oceania in the game as well. So it's an ongoing situation that I'm sort of working through. I've done my own research on it. Some of the managers in Oceania, there's three very clear camps. There's the yes camp, the no camp, and the I don't care camp. And the people who are in the no camp, they do not want Oceania to dissolve. And so I started thinking, could we come up with a solution where we can allow for an Australia and a New Zealand and honour Oceania at the same time? And that way everybody can be appeased, and any history that Oceania has created can be honoured by all three of those potential nations.
You're touching in on a solution here, but if we just take a step back, could you walk me over? Like, why do you think they came up with a solution back then? Like, did we ever hear any arguments from the HTs about why did they actually go with Oceania? Why couldn't they have gone with Australia and then potentially adding other nations like we've seen with the natural expansion of Hattrick in all other cases, really?
Yeah. So to answer this question, I just want to give a big shout out to Kikard, our national coach, who helped me out a lot with understanding the history. If you look at the Hattrick Wiki, it does state that Australia at one point in Hattrick did exist. It was created right back in the very, very early days. But it was a move to merge Australia with New Zealand and the Pacific Island nations, and it came from the managers of the region. So it wasn't driven by the mods at the time, it was driven by the managers. The managers felt that they weren't going to be able to compete if they went with just their own nations. And they asked permission to represent this fictional construct called Oceania. And the position was successful. So from season 3 onwards, Australia was renamed to Oceania. And so, yeah, I guess the managers felt that they would be stronger if they were in a united league rather than as individual leagues, especially for those island nations. Yeah, so as Hattrick grew, there were numerous calls for leagues to be split into the various member countries, and there have even been referendums on the issue, but none of them were successful. And the reason why they were made successful was because the calls for Oceania to be dissolved came from managers outside of our community. So it would be managers from other nations would reach out to the moderators and say, this is not fair. They get multiple nations. We don't get multiple nations. We want you to dissolve Oceania. But the people inside Oceania were against that. So this is not a situation where the mods are just like not being aware of geography in this part of the world. It was a locally driven petition, and locally we fought to retain Oceania. But when these referendums were held, which probably talking about 20 years ago, and those petitions had signatures that it was taken very seriously at the time. The reason why they created Oceania, I feel, is starting to become out of date. And I think maybe it might be time to revisit the issue, but I think it should be done with sensitivity. I think that if we take the time to really reach out to managers and understand their motivations and what they want to retain, then I think an answer can be found. And I just feel that, for me, the ultimate goal is for an Australian to be able to represent Australia, for a Kiwi to be able to represent New Zealand, and to find some sort of way to honour that heritage that has come over 20 years under the Oceanian name. And if you can do all three things, you probably have a solution.
You said something about the argument. Some of the argument is basically outdated. I'll agree on that. But when you look at some of the small regions basically being an island nation, you have a number of active teams there that wouldn't sustain more than a top flight division, like 10 or so. I'm hearing you talk about this balance about Oceania for historic purposes. You've won medals. You have a history to retain in the world of Hattrick. So obviously that shouldn't be removed in any way. And it also serves Oceania as a concept also serves as a way to keep the island nations included, because like some of those island nations are definitely too small to sustain a traditional hatchery community.
Yeah,
I think we can agree on that.
I
So
do agree with that. And like, if you look at the statistics, the way that I understand them, Oceania era's terms is a rebadged Australia and New Zealand. Even when I look at my Oceania Discord, as far as I can find, there are no people in our Oceania Discord that are from the island nations. And that might not be to say that they don't have Pacific Islander heritage. I think that is very likely. But in terms of people that live in those nations, I don't think that it would be like, we're talking a very, very minor percentage. And so a little bit later, when we talk about possible solutions, I do have an idea that can take care of the idea of those very small nations, but it will also allow for the two bigger nations to get their own team identities.
in Denmark, we have this solution. Like we do have the Faroe Islands. It's actually quite similar, because it's also like it used to be part of the Danish the Danish state, and it's not anymore. But it's a region in Danish Hattrick. But it also what do you call it? A nation, independent nation in both real life and in Hattrick nowadays. So we have like a dual solution. Is that something worth considering?
Well, it's interesting what the Orcs are doing at the moment, but they've just made a move to create Tahiti. They're kind of dabbling and trying to create a solution, I think, because it's very similar to the Faroe Islands situation, where an actual nation is a region inside a bigger nation. Like now, people from Tahiti have an option. They can represent the nation of Tahiti, or they can represent the region of Tahiti inside the nation of Oceania. That opens up possibilities, because if you have the option, then there's no reason to suggest if it's going to work for Tahiti, it couldn't work on a bigger scale. So then you could look at doing the same thing for other island nations within Oceania. So Cook Islands, Vanuatu, Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, all of those nations potentially could have the same situation pop up, and one by one you could create them. But what I think would be a better solution is to have those island nations continue to be represented by the Oceanian name, but create an identity for that Oceanian country that's representative of the Pacific Islands. And then Australian managers and New Zealand managers that have represented Oceania for 20-something years, give them the option. So at the moment, Tahiti managers have an option. They can pick either or. So if you keep Oceania in the game and also create a new nation and call it Australia, and another nation and call it New Zealand, Australian managers now have a choice. They can continue to be represented by the Oceania name, knowing that it is now representing the Pacific Island nations, or give Australian managers the chance to have one-off chance to transport their country into the new nation without any penalties. It would immediately make the new nation of Australia very strong. And I think that if you did the same thing for New Zealand, give New Zealand concessions. They're losing a lot. Give them concessions to let them grow for quicker. Because, like, it's kind of like, it's a difficult situation with New Zealand, but in the conversations that I've had with New Zealand managers, they're okay with it. They want to represent their nation. And so the issue that I found having conversations with managers from inside Oceania that have been playing the game for more than 20 years, what they are is emotionally connected to the name that they've represented. So they don't want to lose that. So keep it in the game.
And obviously, they've also established like a club, and they've played for a long period of time. It's also a tough question, because as far as I've heard in any stream talking about Tahiti, and they would never, this is Johan's on stream saying, they would never allow like a club to be moved from one country to another. So I had a question. I might as well weave it in here, Mike. If you were presented with the option to now you can play in Australia, but you have to start over, would you take it? Because I think that's also
And I think that the Mods need to rethink that decision. I think that if you penalise your managers for a mistake that was made 20 years ago by making them restart 20 years of history, I think that is a big mistake. And I think that it can be avoided. I think that if with a little bit more open-minded thinking, that if you get managers a one-off chance to transport from what is essentially a fictional country into their real country of origin, I think that's totally plausible. And I think that it would be worth a rethink, or at least putting it to the Oceanian community. I think you would get more support than you realise. And I don't know, I'm going to admit, I don't know the technical side of having to transport countries from one nation into another nation, but this is a one-off situation. This is a very, very unique situation, and because it's such a unique situation, the solution needs to be a very unique solution, and that requires unique thinking. I thought that the last time that this issue was voted on, Hattrick was a completely different game, and the Australian Hattrick community was very small. That's not the case anymore. Like now, the Australian Hattrick community is thriving. We're not a huge Hattrick nation, but we want to be represented. Like I know that there's people that have come into the game in the last 3-4 years that still don't understand why we are the only nation, us and New Zealand and the island nations, why are we the only situation where we have to play for a fictional country? And so I had this situation come up with a friend of mine who was Fijian. I was talking to him, I told him about this online manager game, and I said, it's a game of patience, and you have to, it's a very slow moving game, but it's so rewarding to play. And so he's like, okay, well, let me set up a team in Fiji. And I looked at him and I went, oh, this is not going to go well, because then I have to explain to him that Fiji didn't exist and that he couldn't play for Fiji. He had to play for a constructed nation called Oceania, and he had to play under an Australian flag, and he had to play for a nation where the national team was named after an Australian concept. And he looked at me like I was crazy. He was like, what are you talking about? And I struggled to explain it to him. Because then you have to go back through 20 years of history to explain this to a person who's trying to play hat-trick after only knowing about the game for 5 minutes. It just doesn't make any sense. So I think that a solution to this, it might be a little bit difficult in the early stages, but over time, I think people will grow to understand the reasons why it could happen. And I think as the new hat-trick nations grow, people will get used to it. It's kind of a situation where you may need to just rip off the Band-Aid, and you might pull up a couple of arm hairs when you rip it off, but in the long run, the wounds are going to heal. And I think it's probably time for them to really look heavily into a solution. What they gain out of it is quite substantial, because they get the Australian-New Zealand rivalry, which is a big deal. That's a big deal down in this part of the world. But any solution, I think, needs to be respectful of all parties, and with careful consideration, I think that there's outcomes that could work. And I think I'm personally on a bit of a journey to bring this issue back to light, and I think that I'm probably the first person from inside the Oceanian community who's brought up the issue. In the past, it's always been managers from outside the Oceanian community talking about what's fair. But what I'm talking about is that I want the chance to represent my own nation.
Right. So talking about the solution, I was this morning standing in the shower and I was thinking, okay, I'm going to do this podcast episode with Mambo from Oceania. I'm like, Oceania. How about that? And then sometimes the good ideas they might just occur when you're out there singing in the shower, right? And I was thinking, what if we took a concept that's already in the game that harbors multiple nations already. If you look at the Hattrick International League structure, if you look at Oceania and you convert it to a league structure that harbors more nations. All right. So for now, you still have this constructed nation, this thing, but it gives you time to in stages say, okay, now we have worked out a concept. We are ready to introduce Australia as an independent nation in Hattrick. Now you do have a team, like you would have 3 teams in Oceania. Like when new managers are able to sign up in Australia, they could choose Oceania or they could choose Australia. From that point on, they could also choose to be an Australian team in Oceania. My idea here is once they introduce a new country, like they say, we start the concept of Oceania as a new international league. But once Australia is in, we're ready to say, from this season on, you can be representative of Australia. You then you're prompted to select all your homegrown players are now either Oceania players or they are Australian players in the Oceania League. Like there's drawbacks to this because obviously if a player has ever represented Oceania on under 21s or on a national team level, they will become Oceania players by default. But this way you have people say, okay, I want to be a purebred Australian player in the new Australian League. Okay, I'll have to accept that I'll have to restart my team. But any other established club could go on producing players for Australia, but playing in the International League, just like a Danish team placed in the Hattrick International League could do so now.
I think that has a lot of
Maybe
merit.
time comes, okay, we're ready to introduce New Zealand. Okay, they get the same prompt. Like you can convert all your homegrown players to be New Zealand players now. But if you want to go on in Oceania because you play in the established community there and you like it because you have history with it, stay. And you always, like, it can always be in stages, right? Okay, we are ready to introduce the next country because I think the reason why there's been worry about the size of Australia and like the whole community back then, 20 plus years ago. I think there's like the framework to actually make a clever solution to this exists with the Hattrick International. And initially, you wouldn't have to worry about how this would mix up the World Cup and all the international play because New Leagues doesn't have a national team initially. So they'll even have time to figure out a solution while they are implementing this. So I was just like, it's there. I mean, we could easily have an Oceania League, and it makes sense because if you have the small island nations that will never be able to sustain their own community, like now they can actually acknowledge, okay, Oceania is not a de facto Australian nation. Now it is Oceania, and perhaps it makes sense. So I was just thinking about this morning. I was like, I actually see a way out of this.
I agree. I think that what you're saying has a lot of merit. I think your answer to the problem is very similar to what I'm suggesting. To be honest with you, it's a great idea. I don't really consider the Hattrick International as an option. But I do agree that the island nations wouldn't be able to sustain. They definitely couldn't sustain a treaty league. What you need to consider is that Tahiti, which has just been introduced, can't sustain a 3-tier league either. But you have the potential in Hattrick, and you have for quite a while now, where international managers can play in any nation that they want to. So if you indeed do create Australia, you're not just getting Australian managers, you're getting managers from all over the world. So the idea that any of these nations are going to be weak is kind of a flawed thinking. Because if you look at some of the people that post content on Hattrick, I'm thinking about Habanish. He runs teams all over the world, and he shows people how to do it and compete and win cups from the moment that a league opens. So if you open up a new country and you call it Oceania, you're going to attract managers from all over the world wanting to win the cup in the first season. So I don't think that numbers is going to be a problem. And it's certainly not going to be a problem if you allow Australian managers take the existing teams and make what we now call Oceania, you make that Australia or rebrand it as Australia, or if you create a new Australia, Australia is going to be competitive just on the basis of the Australian Hattrick community. And the one thing that they need to consider is what are they going to do with New Zealand? I think that they need to make concessions for New Zealand. I love the idea of creating a team, keeping the tradition of Oceania, but renaming the team, the national team, so that like the national team for Oceania Mambo is called the Drop Bears, which is an Australian joke about deadly animals. I think that if you allow that to become the Australian Drop Bears, and then you give New Zealand the chance to represent the Kiwis, and then Oceania can get a name that's representative of the Pacific Islands. Like, why can't we call it Oceania Pacifica? Why can't we call it Oceania Islanders? Something relevant to the oceans. Like, I mean, a lot of people don't realize this, but there is an Oceanian flag that exists. And why isn't it used? If we're representing Oceania, if we really truly are not a rebranded Australia, why do we represent under the Australian flag? Like, that Oceanian flag is a conceptual flag that has been around for many, many years. Why don't we adopt that as the flag of Oceania? It just, conceptually, it doesn't make any sense.
Do you think, like, if we imagined Hattrick changed the flag and more the identity towards the actual region and not a de facto Australia, just straight Australia nation, do you think their stance would change because it wouldn't be there wouldn't be all these visible cues to the de facto Australia
and that's
nation?
the problem. That's the problem because everyone's kind of accepted it is a de facto Australia, and the New Zealand managers kind of accepted it. But that doesn't make it right. And I think that, we're talking about 20 years of history based on a mistake. And I just love the idea of giving people from the Pacific Islands a chance to represent their own nations. And if that has to be under the name Oceania, at least give them the Oceania flag. Because if my friend who's Fijian had the option to represent under an Oceanian flag, that's going to have a better chance of success than if we say to him, you've got to represent under the Australian flag. Like, that's no chance of success. Keeping Oceania alive, I think it has to be part of the solution. It has to be. You cannot just dismiss it because you're going to lose managers that have been playing this game for the greatest portion of their lives. And you just, whatever solution that comes up, you can't dismiss those managers. They are the lifeblood of Hattrick in this part of the world, and they need to be respected. But at the same time, I think that creating options is a good thing. And the monsters they've shown that they're willing to do it. They're willing to give this. They're just sort of experimenting at the moment with Tahiti, and they're sort of saying, can this concept work? Because if it does work on a small scale, potentially it could work on a bigger scale. And I just get the sense that there's just slow movement towards trying to find a solution, but it hasn't been publicized. But for me, I want to be a bit more vocal about it. I'm the kind of person that very passionate about the opportunity to represent my nation, because I know that when you train place for your national team in Denmark, you want them to place in the Danes. For me, when I represent my training program and I talk to my under-21 coach, he gives me a training program that my guy has to go and represent Oceania. I don't want that. And I want to represent my own nation in the game that I love playing. The solution needs to be thought through. And to my surprise, when I started to talk to the Oceanian managers that have been around and have a lot of experience, we're talking like some of our ex-national managers, a lot of them were very open to the idea of creating an Australia. But they all agreed that there are a lot of managers that they've played together a very long time that are just so emotionally connected to the name Oceania that you really need to honour that history. Because Oceania has won medals, the managers that have been part of winning those medals, they would want to keep that history So I would propose that the history of Oceania be honoured by all three nations. So we're talking about honouring it with Australia and New Zealand and any new construct of Oceania, if it does represent the Pacific Islands. I think that all three of those nations should get that history because it was a shared achievement. And so I'd like to see those medals across all those new nations. And I think that would resolve one of the bigger issues in terms of doing this. The whole argument is very emotional. It's not really backed up by, logical thinking. It's an emotional connection to something that they're passionate about playing this game. And the same way that I'm passionate about playing it and want to represent Australia, and I'm very passionate about that. But I understand completely that if you were part of the national team that won a medal for Oceania, you don't want to lose that history. So you need to find the middle ground there. And I think that it is possible to design a stance that's in the middle ground that will be something that everyone could get behind. I think it's probably time for us to have another discussion about this. It's been about 7 years since the issue's come up. And it's only come up because I became vocal about it in my Discord. And I was thinking, oh, I'm going to become a target in my own community. Do I really want to do this? But to my surprise, there was a lot of support, but support on certain issues. And some managers did acknowledge that we are a pseudo Australia. Even the Kiwi managers are kind of understanding of that. As I gathered up information and was talking to all these managers, I started to sort of unpack the issue and understand it better. And when I understood the history, I started to think myself, well, it's an emotional issue. It's not a logical issue. Logically, you can do this from a logical standpoint, but from an emotional standpoint, you have to be taking care of those managers that have played this game so loyally for such a long time.
I mean, the pure logical standpoint from a big game developer perspective is like leave it as it is because that's the easiest, way to keep going, right? But I mean, perhaps it's time for like I was planning to ask if there's any political movement, kind of like with the federation or something. I know I would support it, not in order to say I'm siding with Australia or I'm siding with anyone else, but just to make it a meaningful experience for as many as possible. If the combination of like a logical and emotional concept is perhaps to have this middle ground with Oceania as a not only as a middle ground between those who want. I think it's going to be a hard time convincing Hattrick to do an actual move of teams, simply because I've heard what Johan said about it. But then to have something that can absorb not only those who don't want to throw away their team because of a flag. I'm putting this on, just saying it in some way. I don't mean this exactly like it comes across now, right? But they don't want to start over. They don't want to lose the club. Oceania League could absorb both the needs of the smaller nations and those managers. And it would also be able to honor the history of the medals of the national team, because the national team medal from like the old medals, so to say, could be present on all team pages, and in the future it would be individually achieved by each nation, right? In a sort of way. But
I think in terms of the political movement, there hasn't been one in recent memory up until I started to bring up the issue, and I'm definitely not considering what I'm doing to be any sort of political movement. Definitely no federations or anything like that. I'm actually trying to be as respectful as possible, or gathering as much information as possible from as many sources as possible. But and as I mentioned earlier in our interview, the earlier moves to dissolve Oceania came from outside of Oceania. So the issue's kind of been dormant for a really long time because the attitude of the Australian managers and the New Zealand managers also was like, oh, well, it's in the game now. We're just going to let it be. But in the last few months, I've really questioned the validity of that because a nation that's called Oceania in name alone, it's not representative of the managers that it represents. So it's become this sort of controversial thing that everyone wants to just sort of ignore it. It's like the elephant in the corner of the room. Everyone knows that it's there, but nobody wants to talk about it. And so when I was the first one within the Oceania community to start to have individual conversations with managers privately. And I just said, where do we stand on this? And I gathered up a huge amount of information on it, from the national manager all the way down to managers in our lowest division. I was asking everybody what they thought. And there's definite pros and cons on that issue, but having those extensive chats has given me a bit of a scope for what the situation is in this part of the world, what we actually think and who actually is got what position on the issue. Again, I'm the first person to question it in a really long time, and I'm sure that the mods probably don't want me to bring this up because it's probably a spurring issue. They know it's an issue, they don't want to address it, and they just kind of want to ignore it. But, I just think if it's been 7 years since something was said, in 7 years, a lot can happen in Hattrick. Like, I mean, I've only been playing Hattrick for about 3.5 calendar years. That's a long time. My team has grown a huge amount in 3.5 calendar years. So I don't know how many seasons. That's probably 14 or so seasons of Hattrick.
But certainly, like the move with Tahiti, and I know they've, like Johan said in his stream, it's because it's a FIFA regulated team, so that's the reason why they can do this.
Which I think that's really odd
So the
because
Tahiti situation,
Australia is not
reverse that.
Australia is not associated with FIFA Oceania in any way, and we haven't been since 2006. So we are associated with Asia, and we play in Hattrick. We play in the Asian Confederations Cup. So that argument to me doesn't make a lot of sense from a FIFA perspective. We have no association with Oceania, but yet we have a team called Oceania who play in the Confed Cup in Asia. But they have their own confederation. So if we're using FIFA as the model, then surely that means that Oceania does need to be dissolved and all of those Pacific Island nations need to be honoured. And New Zealand,
Exactly.
New Zealand, which is a part of Oceania at the moment, play in Asia. But they are not part of Asia in FIFA terms. They play in Oceania, and they go through the qualification process for the World Cup, are qualifying through Oceania Federation.
Surely you're talking about like the mods don't want to hear this problem. But if you look at it from the opposite perspective, I mean, if this wasn't a problem for anyone in Oceania, or Australia, or New Zealand, or any other island nation for that matter, if this wasn't an issue, I'm fairly certain that Hattrick in the region in Oceania wouldn't be relevant anymore, because Hattrick thrives off this passion, right? This passion for a game. If you're not, either you're passionate about your club, or you're passionate about producing players and being in the national team's community. If this isn't an issue for anyone in your region, I think it's because Hattrick has lost its relevance completely. So, in my eyes, being from outside your community, I'm thinking, of course, this has to be an issue, and I wouldn't accept it myself. Like, if I'm just imagining being part of Denmark, Sweden, like Scandinavia, where's in Scandinavia? No.
And do you know what?
I don't
the way to think about it from your part of the world is to take all the European nations and rebrand them as Europe. That's what they've done.
Yeah.
They've taken the teams from this part of the world, they've put them all together, and they've rebranded it under the regional name. So could you imagine the uproar if you took every European nation in Hattrick and put them all under one team name and called it Europe? It's just not. It seems to be acceptable in our part of the world because we don't have a large population. But if you tried to do that in Europe, you would blow up your game. It's not really a fair fight in that, like, because down here we don't have the voice to argue it. But because Hattrick is so dominant across Europe, you absolutely couldn't get away with this move in Europe. Imagine if any other region, you couldn't do it in South America, you couldn't do it in Northern America, you can't do it in Central America, Asia. No other part of the world can you do this and have it be an issue for 20 years. You can only have it happen in Oceania because we don't have the numbers. But from a standpoint of making the game right and even across all regions of the world, you have to fix it. You can't just ignore it. And that is where people like me come along. Unfortunately for the mods, I'm the kind of guy who's very stubborn. And when I want to represent an issue, I will represent it to the best of my means. But when I do it, I'll do it with as much respect as possible. So the way that I've gone about it is to try to gather the information that I need so that when I come and do an interview like I'm with you, that I represent everybody's opinion. Even though I have my own stance, I'm very respectful of the opinions of people that want to walk away from the game if Oceania is dissolved. So my solution is don't dissolve Oceania. And I'm hopeful that by putting that forward, it gives the moderators something to think about because they may not have considered a concept, a possible solution where Oceania still exists. They're probably thinking to themselves, well, okay, it's a rebranded Australia. We need to get rid of Oceania, which is going to create a problem. But I don't think that's the case. I think you can keep Oceania and create an Australia and create a New Zealand. And you kind of get the best of all the worlds, you know? And so for me, I just think it's worth having the discussion. I was pleasantly surprised that when I have the private conversation with the managers from our community, that for the majority of them, they're open to the idea. And I don't know that the mods understand that. And I don't know that they have connections into our part of the world that are as strong as they have into Europe. And that's not to say that there aren't mods that are from our part of the world, because there definitely are, and I talk to them quite regularly. I think that the movers and shakers in Hattrick who are making the big decisions, I don't know if the line of communication is as strong with the Oceania community as it could be. And I think if that happened, and, you know, people who are, you know, vocal like myself, if we sat down and had a discussion about what we think the solution could be, I think that you could come up with an answer that you could present to the community. And I think that that would be the first time where the community could say, oh, geez, now I've actually got an option, a real option, and I don't feel like I'm going to be penalized if I take this option. Because I think what the mods are doing to themselves is they're saying, we can only do this if we dissolve the entire Oceania community and all those teams just disappear into thin air. That's not the answer. Like, I've only been playing 3.5 calendar years. Even if I had to make that decision, that's a huge call from my team, because that's 3.5 years of work for me to catch up to the teams that are up in Pacific Premier, which is the top, you know, the top leading out in our part of the world. And so that's a big call. Do you want to start? I mean, I put a lot of money into this game, like a lot of money. So like, I have the top subscription, and so I carry 4 teams. 3 of my teams are part of Oceania. And those 3 teams, 2 of them are startups. And it's a slog. When you start this game, it's hard. You really have to put a lot of hours into it. You've got to go looking for value. And you've got to set up training plans. You've got to save up for coaches. Like, it is a planning man's game. And you've got to consider that if you ask people that have been playing the game for 20 years, you can't keep your team that you've established for your entire lifetime. You have to start again. That is not the answer. And you're just going to drive people out of your game. And they're people that are putting good money into your game. They're the ones that are giving you the highest subscriptions. They're paying a lot of their money that they earn, hard-earned money, to support your game. I know that I put a lot of money into Hattrick. And I want that financial investment to be honoured by people listening to my opinion on this issue. I think that's probably the least that I should want. And there are people that have been playing game from our community a lot longer than me who put in substantially more money than I have and have represented at a national level, that they've trained multiple under 21 players, they've got national team players. They're just at the top of Oceanian football. But even as I say that, I mean, what is Oceanian football? It's a hard issue, but there are answers there if people are willing to sit down and have discussions, and that's where I want to encourage. I want to encourage the laws to think about it from an open-minded perspective, to try to think about, is there a way that we haven't looked at this that maybe we could look at it? And we talk to the Oceania community and see what they think the answers are.
At least have some sort of an investigation of the whole matter. And like, even if the conclusion is, okay, we've looked at it and we can't, we have to stick with Oceania, but just having that problem look at it, I think it's a way of at least showing the community the respect that this matter.
I think that's the least that they owe us, is to at least look at the issue.
Yeah.
And I know that they have in the past, and they've put it to post and stuff, but so the landscape of Hattrick made a difference here. Like, when they made those decisions, those decisions were made on a completely different landscape. And so now, because I've gone out and I've actually done the research and asked the questions, and I'd be very, very curious to see if the right solutions created and it was put to the Oceanian community, could it get across the line? I would want to wager that it would. If it was framed in the right way, we say Australian managers can now have the option to represent Australia. New Zealand, you represent New Zealand, and you get a New Zealand flag. You can call your national team something that's honourable to New Zealand culture. But then you've also got this elephant in the room of Oceania. You don't have to dissolve Oceania, because you've got this opportunity for Oceania to represent Oceanian nations. It just makes sense.
I definitely think, I wouldn't, maybe someone thought about this earlier, but I think constructing a framework where you borrow some of the ideas from the concept of Hattrick International, because that's basically a league that is serving all other countries, right? That might be a way to accommodate those not wanting to start over, but obviously they don't want to start up a new team in an actual country as well. It would actually be fun to do some sketches and think about different ways to look at how you could structure leagues and all that, because it's not a simple question to ask. If it was simple, like we said, they would probably have done something about it already. But I get the fact that it's not simple for Hattrick.
No.
But if you weren't to consider anything about the technical limitations or anything, would you consider playing in such a, like the Oceania League, and have your players perhaps become Australian players, but you have a home in that league instead? Would you consider that option?
I think everything's on the table. I think open discussion means that any suggestion should be considered. And I've never considered your proposal. That is different thinking to what I was thinking, but it doesn't make it a bad idea. And I think that if you honor all the ideas that come forward to you and you try to figure out what's the pros and cons of all of them, eventually, when you whittle it down, you eventually come up with something that could potentially work. So I
if you give it a couple of right.
Yeah, and I think that this issue hasn't been looked at for a really, really long time, because I think the attitude became, we've kind of allowed this to happen, and then it became established in a game, and now to fix it is going to be a technical nightmare. So what we're going to do is we're just going to leave it. But that does not make it right.
No.
So, I'm very thankful for the mods for the game that they put out there. I've got so much enjoyment out of this game, and I don't want this interview to be beat up on the mods, but that's not what this is. I just think that the thing needs to be a little bit more open, and then conversations need to be had. Just accepting that the problem is a too hard basket problem. I don't think that is very good forward thinking, and I think that just if you do address this problem, your game is complete. Like from that point on, every nation is represented, in a way where everybody seems
Always.
and then they can use the model that they've been using to slowly turn, the island nations that are under the Oceania banner, under my plan, one by one, you can like give options to create those nations one by one until you have a situation where Fiji exists and Tonga exists and Samoa exists, but you keep Oceania. You just keep it there. Give it an Oceanian flag, acknowledge that history, and you just have that fictional nation that just exists there. It's like a wild card. It's like, picking up the Joker and a deck of cards.
And if you look at it like if with time you'd see people slowly migrating to their original country, if it ends up being sort of a ghost land where Oceania is in that way empty or almost empty. If it's not a matter of moving, let's say 1,000 teams, but in the end, okay, there's X amount of teams left. Now we will move them because it's such a small maneuver at this point, and then we will not close, or we will retire the Oceania the league, and well, again, it's opening up a process at least. I think we could sit here and talk about a possible solution and like all the aspects of that for. We could go on forever, right? At least we have an idea, right? And we have. I think you guys, especially in the community, have a case to present and model a bit. And I'm fairly certain that if it's repeated, it will have to be a repeating process. You could get proper talks with the Hattrick. You shouldn't at all accept the hard no stance from Hattrick. And also, like you said, it's not about saying it's like anyone's stupid or any, because the reason we sit here talking about it, the baseline of all this is because we love Hattrick and it's such a nice game, right? In order to touch a little on the overall concept of the podcast here, the Hattrick Life podcast, I come from a small country, and basically if I want to go in a Hattrick meetup in the other end of the country, I have to travel for some 4 hours by public transportation. It's quite different in Australia because it's a smaller community in a way bigger country. Do you have things such as meetups and anything in the community?
So I'm from Sydney, and big shout out to my Hattrick best mate, is RS350. He's based in Melbourne, which is about a 10 or 11 hour drive between the two people. So yeah, we have huge distances in Australia. I would imagine that New Zealand might have meetups. I think it would be a little easier for them. Probably North Island, South Island, but for me, up till very recently, I didn't know of anyone that was in my local area until I happened to accidentally come across someone who was from the next suburb, which was because I bought a prospect for under 21, and when I bought in, I got a message coming through, and we found out by accident that we locally know one another. So that was a happy accident. But in terms of organised meetups, I've never been to one. But that's not to say that they haven't existed in the past. I think.
How big is the Sydney?
Oh, it's massive. And I think there's probably.
Oh, but I mean, like, would there be any?
I think there's not a huge amount in my part of Sydney, but I know that in southern Sydney, it's quite a strong community down there. And the North Shore, I've heard of a lot of managers from the North Shore of Sydney. And it's just, Sydney is such a diverse community. People come from all walks of life, and Sydney is a very spread out city. It's
all right.
It covers a massive distance, whereas Melbourne is a much more compact city. So in the nation of Australia, each city has its own unique identity. But if I wanted to go and meet a friend of mine who, if I had someone from Western Australia that played Hattrick and I wanted to go see them, I have to get on a flight. And it's like I go to go and see them. If I wanted to drive, it would take me 4.5 days. Even to go to Brisbane, which is just on the east coast, you're probably looking 11, 12 hour drive to get from Sydney to Brisbane. The distances are just huge. And so each state in Australia kind of gets its own identity. It's kind of like we're kind of our own little pseudo nations. And it's a very unique situation in terms of meetups. But yeah, one thing that I did do is create the Sydney Hattrick Federation, which was a startup federation, and I really wish I had more time to maintain it. But it does have a hat trick ladder for the Sydney Hattrick Federation, which anyone from Sydney, if you're out there, please look me up and join a Sydney Hattrick Federation ladder. I think we have about 5 teams on that ladder. So if you want to win a ladder, that's the one you go for, because I'm coming second at the moment. I'm not even winning my own ladder. Yeah, and that's Sydney. So I think when I looked at hat trick, the Sydney circle for hat trick, there might be about 30 or 40 names on the Sydney circle. And I can't say that I play with any real life friends, but I have made some friends from an online perspective, which I think is pretty common for hat trick. And this is a game that needs a certain type of personality and patience to play it. So, you know, despite my best efforts to win my mates over, I just can't seem to get them to join up. But, you know, I made many good friendships online from talking about and discussing the game. And I just love the game. And I guess because I love the game, I'm very passionate about the game. And so I would like to represent this game at a national level in the right manner, which is why this has all come about in the first place. And so big shout out also to the previous under-21 coach, Norris, and the new under-21 coach, Sango Mango. They were very, very willing to let me become a part of the under-21 structure in Oceania. And they've given me kind of a very low-key understudy type role, which has given me plenty of time. I'm very busy in real life with family, and I'm a school teacher in my real world. Yeah, it's year 3.
Yeah.
And so they've allowed me to come into their systems and pick up the information over a sort of slow, I guess, a drip feed process. And I'm becoming familiar with the systems, and I hope that I will reward them in the coming years by potentially becoming an under-21 coach. And that'll happen over time. But I'm thrilled to be part of that under-21 system because there's so much hat-trick experience in that coaching staff, and I've been able to tap into that, and my ability to understand the game has improved tenfold since becoming part of the under-21 structure. And so, you know, you can learn a lot. I've been playing through time of the years, and in those 3 years, it was a slow burn until I got introduced to the Hattrick Discord and the under-21 coaching staff. And then all of a sudden, this wealth of knowledge came to me that aren't written in the manuals, and it's been invaluable. So I really hope to honor that in the under-21 setup in the coming years.
Sounds kind of similar to some of the guys in the Danish national team community as well, because we have some fairly new managers like trying out and being introductionary members of the team, and so do they're like backed by the rest of the team, and they're like, okay, I'm the coach now, but they're constantly sparring, and I'm hearing about like in their own forum they have like game threads of 500 posts just for one game within Hattrick. So they're really passionate about it as well. But they also they know the fact that they'll need new managers in the setup in order to sustain and become consistently competitive with sharp minds in the seat, because it takes its toll to be the national team managers. And in Denmark, I know for a fact that they are really they're really scrutinizing if you are not performing up to the standards. Sometimes it's even too much, in my opinion, and I don't touch it. I don't write anything about it, even though I'm thinking it's a bit much at times. But people are certainly passionate about the national team, both in Oceania, Australia, and in Denmark. So one thing about Hattrick meetups, if there's ever an idea to host one or something in the Sydney region, of course, because I get how big of a country Australia is, you should definitely go and look into it. I mean, it's so funny meeting up and just having this common thing to talk about. It's amazing how easy it is to talk to other hat-trickers. I've done it a few times, and if I've done so earlier, I think in my hat-trick career, like on my second team or so, when I was old enough to say, okay, I'm going to Copenhagen for a meetup, I think I would have had my team from back then if I had involved myself in such activities early on. But unfortunately, I didn't start going until I started this time around. So I can only recommend try out a hat-trick meetup if you ever get the chance. Definitely
Wow. And I think
so.
as our
Yeah.
community grows, people are sort of getting more interconnected with one another, and with the way that the world is, there's no limitations because you can do things on video. Like, I mean, we're doing this interview from opposite sides of the world, two totally different time zones.
Yeah.
So there really is nothing to stop you from reaching out into the hatchery community. And, I'm thankful for the opportunity for you to come and let me speak about this issue. And yeah, I've really enjoyed it. And I will continue to keep reaching out to people from all over the, you know, international reaches of this game, because it's a game that I put a huge amount of hours into. And it's given me endless hours of enjoyment, and I like talking to people that are like-minded about it. So yeah, thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's my pleasure. I mean, I really like, I love talking about all aspects of hat-trick. I would like to ask you one question because I know most people have, and they kind of get passionate about it in another way. Your favorite ever hat-trick player, like a homegrown player. Do you have such?
So I do.
I mean, I could. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, let me hear it because I could tell you about my current up at my.
Okay, so his name is also Stephen. But it's his nickname is Daddy Cool. Stephen Daddy Cool O'Connor, and he was the only player that has survived from day one of the Wild Hearts all the way through to now. I refuse to sign. He's going into the Hall of Fame, 100%. But he's just started on the decline. He's just turned 28. So, but I'd put seasons and seasons worth of playmaking training into him. And then every time I would change to a different training format, he'd come as part of that training format. So if I was trained passing, he'd get the passing. If there was defending, he did defending, and so he's grown and grown and grown. But I kind of had a slow start with him, so he's sitting just over about 100,000 TSI. I have one other guy who's got about 150,000 TSI, but back when I was setting the team up, I really didn't understand about specs. So currently my best TSI doesn't have a spec, which is something I kick myself about every time I look at him. But yeah, my new training plan, which is the one which I'm working with the under 21 team, every player that I've brought in has a spec. And every single one of those players has a training plan. So I've learnt so much from having that first pass, that now when I do my training, that it's much more regimented and it's planned out. But
Again, this whole, oh, sorry, I'm
that's all
interrupting
right.
again. I was just thinking again, like, if you talk about the greater iterations with the whole team, and now it's iterations about like the actual training programs, like you keep perfecting in hat-trick, right?
That's
But
the dream for this game.
even though it's,
Is that like you constantly learn, and you're making mistakes all the time, and you learn from those mistakes, and then you get better at your craft, but then you make new mistakes, and then you're reaching out to people to ask them constantly about ways that you can improve the way that you run your team, and you keep learning things. Like, I'm constantly learning things about this game, different strategies. Like, I've taken on information from our national team. I've taken it on from your videos. I've taken it on from other videos. So I've been on Hattrick Wiki. I've read the unofficial manual. Like, I've done it all. But there's still so much more to unpack, and to understand the game on a deeper level. It's such a complex game when you break it down to how it operates. And when you start to understand that, you realize just how much has to go into it if you really want to perform at the top levels. So it's a fascinating game, and I love it. I think that the analytical side of it really appeals to my the way that my mind works.
Yeah. Yeah, I can always say I feel the same way. And I also, another nice part of the game, you could easily, everyone could come and say, oh, my game, it's really the community that matters. But I can only say, like, from also producing hat trick related YouTube stuff, and like everyone's so supportive. I barely get any negative comments about the stuff I do. And people, if you ask and you talk to people in the communities, they're so helpful and they just want to share knowledge about the game. I mean, I think a lot of people understand that if we don't help each other, people die. So you have to be open about newcomers and help them into the game, because otherwise we don't get any new blood. And it is hard to get into it.
Yeah, it's definitely not very for
Definitely.
that initial startup experience probably needs a little bit of work in Hattrick. I was able to start it up again because I played it some 20 odd years ago, so I understood what I was getting into. But if you're coming into it completely brand new, it can be just so much to try to take in and to understand. So really setting up a team on a base level, they've done a good job in like getting their teams to be set up, and you do the manager license. But then once that's over, then you kind of left to your own devices, and you've got to go looking for the information, which is a process. It's taken me a long time to understand all the places that I can go to get information. So yeah, whenever I see somebody that's new comes into one of my leagues, I try to be very supportive, because more often than not, they kind of get beaten quite soundly. And then the game moves, and like at the moment in my league, Wild Hearts are running dead last in my league, even though I've been competitive in that league for about 6 seasons, because the quality of teams that are demoting are so high that like I can't really go with them. So it's pushing me down my own league. So that's not a bad thing. It just makes you want to work harder. And so, I'm expecting to demote this year, but it will give me some time to set up my training plans, and then when I come off, I expect to, promote quite a few times in a row. So I'm sure there's a couple of achievements that will come with that, so I'm not all that mad.
Nah, you have to accept it. That whole concept of being a newcomer in Hattrick, that could be a whole podcast episode altogether. So perhaps we could talk about that some other time. But I think if we are to summarize here, you have a good case in your community. You want to like keep it up. Don't accept no for an answer. I'm with you guys. I think it should be a meaningful solution for your leagues and your countries and your national teams. Yeah, I'd love to convey any kind of meaning that I can in my little Hattrick community. Hattrick should be meaningful to everyone.
I'm thankful for the opportunity as well for you to use your audience to give me a platform to bring up the issue. I think without you agreeing to do this interview with me, I probably don't have any platform other than, my individual conversations, which, to be honest, although like I'm trying to, gather information, would have taken me way too long, and it just would have probably petered out. But I think by putting this to a wider audience and posting it online, it gives me scope for an international audience to hear the issues. And I think that's only a good thing. I think that it brings it to light, and then who knows where it goes from there. For me, I just think it's probably it's the right way to go about it. I try to be respectful about it. I understand that Muay have a really hard job, and at the same time, I just think just because something is hard doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. And I think you learn the most things in life by the mistakes that you make. I think it's a learning curve for everybody, and it's worth it to work through the issues.
Yeah, I think it's due time to make a sound solution to this matter for sure. All right, Mambo. Thank you so much for taking your time to make this episode.
Yes, thank you very much for having me on. I really enjoyed it, and hopefully we get a chance to do it again sometime.
All right, certainly. And we could be talking about the national teams or perhaps new user experiences. Certainly. All right, thank you so much.